Yo, how are you doing, folks? Welcome to a very special live of The Simple Life. I am joined tonight by three wonderful guests to discuss the 50th anniversary of the Misuse of Drugs Act, legislation that has led to arguably some of the worst outcomes socially, economically, individually, for millions of consumers of any illicit substance in this country. I will, without further ado, give you an insight into these individuals by introducing them. We have, going round from left to right, we have Phil Monk in the top left there, we have Cleo Lake in the bottom left, and we have Danny Kushlick in the bottom right. In that order, could you fine folk please introduce yourself?
I guess that'd be me first then, wouldn't it? I'm Phil Monk, founder of a grassroots community group called We the Undersigned Have a Human Sovereign Right to Cannabis. Was founded in 2018, trying to raise a human rights challenge against the government regarding the prohibition of cannabis. Since that time, we've had medical use permitted, but the campaign continues for the end of prosecutions and full adult use to be permitted. We haven't actually managed to make our case through lack of fundraising as it happens, but we've managed to build the evidence bundle. We're ready to go. It's just about getting the funds. So yeah, that's who I am.
Excellent, thank you.
Evening, everyone. I'm Cleo Lake. I'm based in Bristol. I've just finished being a local councillor for 5 years. And within that time, as a Green Party councillor, we did actually table a motion at full council for safe consumption rooms. Bristol is a busy city, a popular city, as most of you will know, not without its issues and its problems, but it's also a party city, a festival city, and you know, we're trying to take a far more proactive and realistic approach to some of the situations we have. More recently, I stood as the Police and Crime Commissioner candidate for Avon and Somerset, and part of the manifesto was to deprioritise the approach to cannabis possession and small-scale personal use growing. So that was one of the pledges that we had. Also moving forward now, I'm part of the Green Party Drugs Policy Group, and we have our AGM coming up soon. So we also have the biggest number of Green councillors now following the local election in Bristol. So very much hoping that we can get some kind of drug policy and reform agenda on the table and get some motions passed at full council, hopefully to inform direction of travel nationally.
Excellent, thank you. Danny?
Hi, I'm Danny Kushlick. I'm also Bristol based. 27 years ago now, I founded a campaign to end the global war on drugs and replace it with an effective, just and humane system of legal control and regulation, the legalization of drugs. At the time, I was a drug counsellor working with individuals in the criminal justice system. So as well as being an illicit drug user myself, more importantly for me, I was dealing with some very, very damaged individuals whose lives were being ruined, and people were dying as a result of the fact that their drugs were prohibited. At the same time, I recognized that prohibition was creating chaos in producer and transit countries. So from Afghanistan through Mexico, Colombia, everywhere, almost everywhere was suffering as a result of maintaining a global war on drugs, the global prohibition. And the obvious way out of that is to legalize and bring them under state control. So 25 years later, I retired from doing that, and I'm now open to job offers.
Great way to put it. I like it. I like it. All right, guys, thank you for your introductions there. I suppose we'll dive straight in with a very... Oh,
You're not going to answer the door?
No worries. It's what I love about the format of these lives that we've all gotten so used to over COVID, is that we have to live our lives and then we're going to sit in front of a screen for a little bit and try and have these conversations, yet we can't pause life. These aren't television studios. Oh, I can see...
Hi, sorry about that.
I'm going to turn my fish tank off because it probably sounds like someone's taking a tinkle in the background when I'm speaking. So I'll be back.
Thank you for that, Phil. So without further ado, guys, we will jump in, I suppose, with the first question of the evening, which is the Misuse of Drugs Act fit for purpose? Anyone feel free to jump in with the first response.
Well, I'd love to start. I think that it clearly isn't fit. Well, it depends which purpose you want. And I think that this is the important question we have to ask. Given that the Misuse of Drugs Act has managed to sustain itself and been sustained both by voters and by politicians, it clearly does serve a purpose. But let's look at why. I think it's good to start why it's from my point of view wrong in principle and catastrophic in practice. It clearly, and at the same time, recognize that it serves political power and that it serves criminal enterprise. And not that those are automatically linked. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. All that money isn't being siphoned out of the cocaine trade and given to Boris Johnson or Keir Starmer. That's not how it works. But clearly that there are significant power bases, both economically and politically, that it does serve. Otherwise, it wouldn't continue. So it clearly is serving some purpose, but in terms of the way that it operates, it is exactly the same, except on a much vaster scale, than alcohol prohibition was in the US between 1920 and 1932. And I think it's just a really useful historical lens through which to look at the contemporary prohibition because of what it did. It took a legal trade, made it illegal, brought the mafia in, brought a lot of violence in, made the product very dirty and dangerous, and just created absolute mayhem for 13 years. Once it was re-legalized and regulated, all that ended. And now it's just the alcohol business, which isn't the loveliest thing in the world. You know, commercialization, and particularly unfettered commercialization, is pretty ugly. But it's a hell of a lot better than prohibition. And I think that the other thing to remember is that prior to 1971, when the Misuse of Drugs Act came in, the UK by default, partly because it had a very low number of drug users, and partly because the policy really wasn't set in stone the way that the Misuse of Drugs Act accomplished that, we effectively had a health-based approach. And in terms of being fit for purpose, what you actually need is a policy that regulates production and supply and looks after users. And that's the opposite of what the Misuse of Drugs Act did. It gifted the production and supply to unregulated producers and suppliers and put users at enormous risk. And that is why it's unfit for purpose. But I'm sure our other panelists can talk about some of the detail of that. But really, I think it's important to look at the principles that sit behind it. Otherwise, you can get bamboozled by 10% or 20%, and then you begin to look at the money, and then it's... So I think it's really important to look at the principles, and the principles are just wrong, and the outcomes are catastrophic.
Excellent response. Thanks, Danny. Other guys, you got any thoughts on this?
Mind you, would you like to speak first, Cleo, or do you want me to jump in?
I noticed you took yourself off mute before me, Phil, so you can go ahead.
Okay, sure. I don't know Zoom etiquette. I find Danny's points there very well made, and the first question is, what is the purpose of the Misuse of Drugs Act? And that purpose needs defining in order to be able to answer that question. You've also got the I'm trying to think of the word, the overt purpose, the one that it's written on the top of the legislation. And you've also got the covert purpose, the purpose that the politicians are utilising the policy for. So I think it's a bit of a binary question, really. We need to ask, is it serving its purpose from the politician's point of view for social control and coercion and maintaining various profits and their invested interests, or from the purpose that is stipulated at the top of the legislation to reduce harm, reduce the use of drugs? Has it achieved in those aims? It's catastrophically failed. But from the political point of view, it's a very successful policy.
It's a vote winner, yes, definitely.
Yeah, I think I agree with what's been said, obviously, and again, we do know that the reduction in harm hasn't occurred. It hasn't been achieved. So that has to be, we would hope, the primary factor. Politics aside, if we can, people's safety should be at the forefront of any of these policies, and that's clearly failed. The result of it has also been very oppressive. There's class and racial factors that come into it, and also the stigmatization of the classification of this and the criminalization. These are all the things that make it perhaps harder for people who need support to seek support and to feel confident in doing that, or equally to feel comfortable in how people choose to live their lives. So no, it's not fit for purpose, and of course we're going to discuss how we can go about reform, transforming, and challenging this. And I am slightly encouraged to know that we do have at least 50 MPs who are discussing this, and I think it's important that we do what we can to get in dialogue with those MPs who are willing to discuss and hopefully move towards reform.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think if that's 50 MPs, then that's what, 1 in 7 of the current lot of them. So that's pretty good going, all things considered. We live in an interesting world where the points you've just brought up there so wonderfully demonstrate the issue we have here. Is the people who are informed and aware of what the potential harms and damages of drugs actually are from first-hand experience, or from being in some form of reform or recovery, or one of the other sort of, for lack of better phrasing, fringe industries attached to drug dependency, they have a much more rounded idea of how to approach this thing. Whereas the radicals of people on the other side of it that have never had any first-hand experience with this, they're just taking the political rhetoric. They're taking what is being told to them and going, oh my God, one spliff and they'll go crazy and they stab each other. They'll take one mushroom and they'll jump off a building thinking they can fly. They're really on board this information, and rather than the politicians and sort of media channels using that as an opportunity to educate the masses, they perpetuate and promulgate more and more propaganda. You saw what we saw with the what was it called, that monkey dust, the monkey dust sort of thing we saw a few years ago, and then we saw with the grandiose approach with spice, and we saw with bath salts and all of these things with where the hyperbole conversations around fentanyl and things like that. It fits their narrative, as we've said, politically. So I guess it is fit for purpose if you're a politician, or if you're someone who's happy to use this thing as a way to gain more social or political, economic sort of control and power. Well, seem pretty in agreement with that. I'm happy to move on to sort of the... Oh, go on, Danny.
Yeah. No, I was just going to say, I think it's important to recognise that I mean, we talk about political power, but it's actually party political power. We exist and have existed in a two-party system for a long time, apart from a brief hiatus of coalition. But it's important to recognise that the politics that sits behind this is the Labour Party and the Tory Party. It was the Misuse of Drugs Bill was initially brought to Parliament by the Labour Party under Harold Wilson in 1970. But after a freak win by Edward Heath that year, it was reintroduced by the Tory Party, unamended, and backed to the hilt by both parties. And I think it's important to note, I mean, I spent a really nerdy and fascinating weekend a couple of years ago poring over the Hansard for the debates I think both the Parliament, the House of Commons debates, not the Lords debates. And it's extraordinary to see the level of fear, of ignorance, and of a knee-jerk move to employ state violence rather than state care, because that's a choice. That's a choice that politicians make. And it's not that the state is all bad. It's just that it has a choice over which kind of face to show. And it chose to use brutality and state violence through the Misuse of Drugs Act to deal with something about which they knew virtually nothing. One of the really interesting interventions at the very start of the debate was, I'm pretty sure, a Labour MP who said that they wanted alcohol and tobacco to be included as part of the debate, which would have been fascinating. at the very least, to provide a counterfactual for legal regulation and state care and a public health-based approach, to set that against and compare against a prohibition-based approach, and even then to consider potentially making alcohol and tobacco illegal. Because if prohibition's so great and you're actually dealing with health, then why not apply it to those drugs as well? And as Cleo was saying, the issue here is to a great extent, the race part of it is driven by discrimination. It was the discrimination that identified opium, cannabis, cocaine, and various other drugs that were primarily seen to be used by people of color. And that then maintains the whole system as a discriminatory prohibition. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's wider than that now. A lot of white people use drugs, but it was to do with perceptions. I think the perception of the other, and I think that again becomes apparent if you go back. And it really is fascinating just to dip into Hansard. You can just go and look it up. Look up the Misuse of Drugs Bill in Hansard online. It's horrifying to see the way they dismissed evidence and operated out of fear and ignorance.
Interesting. It's interesting you mentioned the racial aspect there. And during the collation of the evidence, the WTU evidence bundle, which we had put into a book form so people can purchase it to try and raise money for the form. That is a shame, by the way. We had a section there, evidence from 2016, 2018, about the disproportionate racial application of the law. And just looking at these figures here, I've got arrests for detainees, offences, possession and supply. And it basically looks like over 2016, 17 and 18, for the BME, the ethnicity they've described, it was 72% on the first year, 72% the second, 74% in 2018 of a percentage of all the arrests that were the BME community, with 28, 27 and 25% respectively for the white community. So it shows that there's like 2/3 disproportionate racial application of the law there. And that's just off these 3 small tables in this little small evidence bundle from just 2 years. And I'm seeing it again with the knife crime. I was watching a video on social media, a gentleman of African descent. He was walking down the street and was accosted by the police because they thought he might have a knife on him. And he asserted his rights fairly and walked away unscathed. But again, it's just this assumption that people of colour are, well, I think it's just been used as a tool to be able to attack that sector of society. But now too many white people are using it as well, and that's why it's becoming a bit of a problem. But that's the way it's just totally a racial repressive tool, I think.
Yeah, those are really staggering statistics, aren't they, that you've just read out? You know, even with the sort of stop and search and the statistics that we looked at through Avon and Somerset, that, you know, very few of them result in anything. So kind of, you know, many of them unfounded. And again, it is quite alarming, because we can look at America and think, well, you know, it's a different kettle of fish and it's over there. But actually, it feels like we're not that far behind in many ways. And you can actually, you know, track and trace the historical legacy of enslavement over to the prison system and all the rest of it, and the exploitation of people being criminalized, you know, being told to say that they're guilty of things, or ending up being charged and sent to jail for very, very minor offences. So yeah, I think it all stems from a particular type of state control, a particular type of fear, probably somewhere as well, in the psyche of people in power. And again, this sense of institutional reform, awareness and challenge to some of these institutional legacies that we're left with, both in America and both in the UK.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I wanted to just rattle off a couple of statistics for the audience here while we're on the point. For 2019, I think it was, that I've written this down, 21% of convictions after stop and search in the UK were for black people, who represent 3.6% of the population in this country. Yet they're 1/5 of the people charged. So not including the people stopped, it shows that the disproportionate nature between the charges of races and ethnicities is extreme. You can go on ONS and look at this. The last statistics available, 2019 to 2020. 1 in 3 UK prisoners is inside for drugs-related offences, whether it be sale, dealing, possession, or inquisitive crime, or other crime to support drug habits. The reoffending rate for drugs, if the Misuse of Drugs Act was any kind of deterrent, would be low. It's not. It's one of the highest. It's around 40% on average across the country. The illegal drug market is currently worth an estimated £10 billion a year, yet the UK government estimates that they spend £20 billion a year trying to eradicate it. The UK drugs market is also taxed since David Cameron and George Osborne did a calculation on this to work out the figures. They tax it at a point of, I think it's 1.1 billion a year. What else did I want to bring up? And upon the deterrent side of things, an interesting statistic that's just come out is over the last 10 years, drug use has risen between 16 and 59-year-olds, 8.6%. Again, showing there is no deterrent. It doesn't seem to work. So with that in mind, if the Misuse of Drugs Act isn't evidence-based, as we've kind of already discussed, it doesn't reflect reality, what is holding this up? We've discussed that it's potentially racism and socio-economic arguments and a bit of classism that's kind of bundled it together. But what has kept it rolling for 50 years? How is it that we have the statistics, we have the truth, we have all of this lived experience of millions of consumers of all substances around the world, yet their voices are silenced?
I would just say corrupt politicians. That's just my humble opinion. They're too invested in too many conflicted interests. It's within their interest to keep everything prohibited in the status quo the way it is, and to change it would just threaten rock the boat too much for their comfortable position. I think a lot of it's to do with that. If it wasn't for corruption, we wouldn't be here now.
Well, it's an interesting point, isn't it? And again, we see where I live in Bristol quite often younger people who happen to be of African descent, arrested, the streets cleaned up in inverted commas, and these small-scale dealers dealt with. But we never hear much about further up the chain. And I wonder where we end up once we go very far up the chain. And again, kind of slightly connected to perhaps something Phil was alluding to, I think that's probably part of an issue, part of corruption. We can only speculate, but it does seem... I wouldn't put it past them, is what I'd say, and again, it is about, to really get to some of the root causes as well of this, it is looking at the poverty factor, why people are having certain lifestyles, how that legacy has been inherited, and what will be the solutions coming out of it,
Few things cross my mind from what you say there, Cleo, about like going up the chain, for example. We have a prime minister that is known to have used cocaine, and previous prime ministers known to have used cannabis, yet they remain in their positions and aren't dismissed. But if someone works in B&Q and use cannabis, they get sacked. So I find that a very interesting thing, that if not corruption, we could call it blatant hypocrisy, where I would say the political class, they're able to utilise substances of their choosing. In fact, there's more drugs in Westminster and prison on the streets, quite possibly. If they can't keep drugs out of Westminster or prison, what hope have they got of keeping them off the streets? So it goes all the way up to the top, unfortunately. And I've lost the thread of my second thought, so I'm going to wait for that to come back to me and let someone else speak.
Is it then interesting? I'm thinking of the Upton Sinclair quote came to mind. It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it. So
I think it's spot on, Simple. I think that's more the point. I think I think corruption is difficult. Like I say, I don't think that there's many politicians who are earning significant backhanders from dealing drugs, and I think that's what corruption alludes to. And I'm sure you weren't saying that all MPs who voted.
No.
We're doing that, Phil, either. But I think that there's an interesting. I went and looked up the etymology of corruption a few years ago. Again, because I'm nerdy and I've got too much time on my hands. And it actually comes from a root word meaning broken. And I think that the sense of a broken system that has led to the failure to operate around evidence, and effectively really that governance in its widest sense really struggles to meet the needs of people and is often self-referential and meets the needs of politicians. And I think that's probably more what Phil was alluding to, is that it's more to do with the failure of government to act on behalf of citizens, and its general tendency to operate either on the behalf, not so much on the behalf of individual parliamentarians, but certainly to act on behalf of political parties and the class to which they're attached in the case of the Tories, and in the same sense, the Labour Party, insofar as they have created such a level of fear amongst working class people that then their political power depends on repeating the same rhetoric and memes that hold prohibition in place, which is we're keeping your community safe by having lots of police in there, and we're stopping drugs, and here's a picture of police with some drugs, despite the fact that the amount of drugs that they get in terms of interdiction is actually somewhere between 1% and 5%. Yes, you heard that right. 95% as a minimum of drugs that come into this country or that are grown in this country and produced in this country reach their consumers. And that, if that's not a failure, I don't know what is. So I think it's really important to look at this in its widest sense, because whilst drugs is a particularly egregious example of the failure of government to operate around evidence and to meet the needs of citizens, there are many others too. And if you look at the way that the government handled the coronavirus, I mean, that was corrupt, and I think it's very obvious that the level of cronyism there. But I mean, it dwarfs the figures that Simpa, you just mentioned, in terms of the 10 billion value of the trade, the 20 billion cost of policing prohibition. The government handed out at least 37 billion to its mates for PPE that never appeared, and interventions that didn't work, like track and trace. And I think that this is, it's part of an endemic problem that exists now, certainly in the UK and other governments, where none of policy, or very little of policy, is actually governed by evidence, or governed by the need, or founded on the need to meet the needs of citizens. And when it doesn't meet need, nobody gives a shit, or at least not at the level that they should. I mean, we do, but I think that there's a real problem here, where the fact that the government handed out all that money for a track and trace system that never worked to people who, I don't know, made pianos and had stable yards. The Tory party got back in and would get back in tomorrow. There's a real problem here in terms of the relationship between citizens and government, which means that evidence isn't playing anywhere at the moment. And I think it's worrying, to say the least.
Isn't part of that then, do we think, down to media? Because if media was doing its job and holding government to account, it would be, instead of backing political ideology and following prohibition, it would be challenging it. There are the odd sort of thing, I'm thinking of the Herald up in Scotland, they have the odd campaign here and there where they're actually directly challenging the Scottish government. But mainly, most mainstream media, because it's conglomerated and owned by a handful of people, especially local media. If you look at Reach PLC, they just regurgitate the same crap stories. What to do if your neighbour's smoking cannabis, with then pictures of cannabis farms with outlandish figures attached to them that don't make any sense. So
it's true. The media has a lot should carry a lot of the blame here. But having said that, the Times called for a move towards legal regulations and supply of all drugs in an editorial, I think in 2016. Not that the Times has a campaign on that, but that's quite a significant move and received very little attention. It's an extraordinary thing to have done, particularly as it comes out of the Murdoch empire. So there's a real, I don't know. I think that there's even a dislocation between government and media, which means a lot of that stuff just rubs off too. So I think that I think there's a real need to reaffirm and restore a more accountable relationship between politicians and citizens. Because if we don't have that, it would make any reforms that were made vulnerable to change anyway. They could all go back. Interestingly, the only place where things have moved forward quickly and substantively and substantially is the US, where because they have citizen-led ballots, then politicians are just removed from the picture. And the ballots just win again and again and again and again. And it's not like the polling shows that nearly 50% of UK citizens support the decriminalisation of possession or the legal regulation of cannabis. They just bloody vote for it and the shops get set up. Now, there's an ugly side of that in terms of, like I said, the commercialisation. But the bottom line is that the prohibition's gone. And it just goes like that because they vote it out. But that's because they have a particular form of democracy. I mean, the other places they've done that significantly is Switzerland. But I think that in the absence of an opportunity effectively to hold local referenda or to have that fierce statewide level of democracy, there's a real problem because politicians are holding on to it for all the wrong reasons.
Yeah, and just to come in there, I think, media and education, because even at a local level, if we look at what are the citizens' priorities, and if they are a certain thing, why are they a certain way? Why would someone think it would be important for police to stop a group of young people because they had a few spliffs on them, rather than address X, Y, and Z that's happening somewhere else? Why is the mentality there? And just to illustrate that point, there was something on Twitter this week, put out by a youngish youth worker, actually, and her quote, the quote was, "Imagine stopping what will most likely be working class and or black youth for a little zoo when you've got big office men in suits with bags of coke on them on a daily and thinking that this is anyway comparable to the harm inflicted on communities." And this person had retweeted Enfield police, who have an Operation Boxster, and they said 3 positive stop and searches tonight. Officers will continue to target individuals involved in drugs who are causing issues in the local community. And it is literally a photograph of 1 spliff and 2 very small bags of weed. Luckily, that attracted over 1,000, hits on Twitter. So that is about also getting public opinion that way and getting the message out. But again, what are the priorities locally? And if we can inform locally, then we can have, deprioritization and all of that via a PCC. But it's about putting pressure on, and it's about galvanizing that public opinion and educating the other people who aren't quite on that page for unknown reasons, really, that don't make sense.
Well, yeah, I think a lot of it comes as what we've already kind of touched on this evening, of the racist, classist sort of arguments of this. Again, if we look at the statistics, if you are sort of the child of an affluent individual, both your parents are fully employed, when the judge then were to speak to you going of your case, oh, well, you've come from a good background, you have potential of a good future, we wouldn't want to harm that by giving you a record. Yet they then take someone from a lower socioeconomic class, or even regardless of ethnicity at this point, and they go, you have no future because of the consequences of our policies, but that's over here. And they then write you off. You then go, you've come from a bad neighborhood, you're in a bad area. One of the things that's terrifying about this, Durham Police now uses an AI program to work out rescind rates. What rate of people of certain areas and certain crimes are gonna repeat offend. The data that they have fed into this goddamn thing is like 20 years of racism and classism. So the machine then goes, oh, these black people, these brown people, and these poor people are going to have all the drugs. Leave all those rich white folks alone. Those affluent areas never have crimes. It's a real backwards thing. So the data is now metastasizing and mutating to self-reference itself. So they can then just point to their own data and go, well, look this. And it's then even harder for us to go, well, maybe you've got that microscope the wrong way around. Maybe there's a certain reason why you're having to police poorer neighborhoods. Is it got something to do with perhaps escapism? The fact that people from lower socioeconomic and disadvantaged backgrounds are more likely to use substances that give them a form of escape from the pain of their reality, whether it be mental, physical, social, emotional, whatever. It gives them that little break from it. And we know that in areas where then the drug rates are higher because people are then having to use the drug trade to survive things like benefit sanctions, that there's going to be an increase in drug trade. But then if you over police that area, all you're going to do is you're playing whack-a-mole. You're pushing one down, another comes up, and they're wondering why this is now mutated into county lines, and we have children stabbing each other and dealing drugs for third generation gangsters that sit on their arse and just get that money.
Yeah, that's a reality of a side of it, and then I guess the other side of it is the reality of the middle classes and everyone else who also do drugs, and they're not being kept safe either. You know, perhaps other people will have more statistics on this, but again, in the kind of place we are in Bristol, without regulation and the recreational drug scene, you know, again, we've tried to campaign and we have had a few pilots of drug testing for festivals and clubs, and I'm, you know, quite mindful of what's going to happen now that the clubs are opening again, and we're going to get a few festivals after, you know, with the mental health as well of a lot of the young people who've been in lockdown. Again, just to have this kind of backward and unrealistic approach to dealing with this is really, really harmful and out of touch. So it affects a lot of demographics of people, so that attitude isn't safe for anyone.
I just want to... Sorry, go ahead, Phil.
No, go ahead, Danny.
No. I've been with
I was just thinking of the police officer stopping a bunch of youngsters walking down the street with the new suits in their pocket, like Cleo was just referring to, and how, you know, if it's alcohol, well, generally they're left unmolested. There's a bit of a drinking in the streets rules nowadays, but if police find people or youngsters with alcohol acting appropriately, it doesn't necessarily result in criminal sanctions that pretty much are life destroying. Whereas if it's the other substances that people use recreationally, they seem to be happy to jump on those. For me, I think it should all be a health approach and treated as alcohol in essence, or the people that consume drugs treated the same as alcohol consumers. I loved your point, by the way, Danny, about state care and state brutality. Alcohol consumers are treated with state care. Alternative substance consumers are treated with state brutality. And that's the bit that needs to change, because it doesn't improve health at all. But I just wanted to make that comparison between police stopping children or people with alcohol and if it was a few joints or whatever else. That disparity in treatment needs to be addressed, I feel.
I just a couple of things to throw in. I think that on the positive side, some of the changes that have taken place over the last few years by enlightened PCCs and enlightened chief constables have led to progressive reforms at force level across significant areas, including Durham, Avon and Somerset, Thames Valley and North Wales, where PCCs and chiefs have worked together effectively to stop the enforcement of the possession laws. But some of them are, it's more nuanced than that. So there's often something that people, or at least that the possession laws aren't enforced fully, which means that people don't get a criminal record. And in some places, they're not enforced at all. I don't know if I've mentioned West Mids as well. There really has been some great work done by senior cops together with PCCs and who've really moved this forward. And it's where change has taken place, where real change has happened, where people don't get as much of a sanction as they did before, and also places where police have been very supportive of drug testing. But it's really sad that this has to be done despite the fact that this is in opposition to or at least not led by the Home Office and not led by government. It's actually done at local force level, despite the fact that the government continues to and the opposition, both Tories and Labour, continue to support the Misuse of Drugs Act and its enforcement as a whole. So it's just to come to Cleo's point about drug deaths, whilst there are middle-class people who get affected, the majority of people who die as a result of using illicit drugs are people who die as a result of using heroin and crack, and they're more likely to be from deprived working class backgrounds by a significantly long way. But I think that the way that outfits like Anyone's Child, a campaign of Transforms, has highlighted through the voices of bereaved parents the deaths of middle-class kids has had a significant play in parts of the media that it wouldn't have got otherwise, because a lot of people just don't care about the deaths of what they perceive as junkies. Yeah. So heroin users, particularly, whose deaths way outweigh deaths from other drugs, their deaths are barely even come to public attention, and despite the fact that the UK has, I think now, the highest death rate in Europe, and Scotland has the highest drug-related death rate in the world, I think.
Yeah,
it's an appalling point to have reached. And if you really are, as Phil was saying, concerned about the health of citizens, killing them is not the way forward.
Yeah, well, definitely, as you bring up some wonderful points there, I thought I'll just throw out a few quick statistics there. So for the most recent records that are available, there were 4,393 deaths in the UK from what they're calling drug poisonings. The death rate for heroin has doubled since 2012, and the death rate for cocaine has increased 5-fold. So it just shows the idea of punitive measures of consequences, as we've discussed with the rescind rate, it doesn't really seem to do anything. So what if we're then starting to look at this? I mean, one of the points that I wanted to actually circle back to before I go into this next one that you mentioned there before, Danny, is with Durham, and I think there's now 9 police forces discretionarily out of the 42, 43 constabularies that in some way either operate a checkpoint diversion scheme or have flat out deprioritized low-level possession of most drugs. They're really starting to try and view that from a different lens and watch what's happening in those communities. So then if they're not taking fathers away, that doesn't then send mothers to go rob to put money to put food on the kids' table. But one of the interesting consequences we're seeing, that is something I've rallied against Portugal for a long time, is if we don't regulate and control supply, you end up with really bad people dealing with this. So I can think of 2 of the hydroponic shops in the northeast who's now have signage in Albanian and Lithuanian, because that's how popular the customs are. They turn up in blacked out brand new Mercedes vans, they buy entire pallets, and they're setting up these huge enormous grows, and what they're doing is they're growing it under really not the best of means just to get the maximum amount of yield. They're then dumping boxes, as in kilos of this, into areas where it was 20, 30 people would grow to survive, and it paid bills, and it kept food on tables, it kept clothes on backs. They're now out of it. They're having to look at other drugs. They're now having to look at other crimes. They're having to find other ways to supplement their income because they've lost this thing of it. And this is something that I just wanted to get you guys' thoughts on, about how we legitimize the dealer, because we demonize the criminal gangs, the really serious violent thugs, as we rightly should. But the vast majority of dealers and drug dealers that I've come across in my life are just people. They are usually somebody that either has a habit or an enjoyment of one substance and understands economics, that if they buy more, they get theirs free and they can make money back on it. To them, it's a transaction, it's a business. So I was just sort of wondering what people's thoughts are on how we bring those decent folk to the forefront.
Well, I like to think of the term as an equitable access scheme, is what I think of it as in my head. Equitable not being equal, if you know what I mean. And at the moment, like we have currently an entire country that is being supplied for cannabis, is obviously my thing mainly, but all other illicit drugs. And at the minute, the only thing is they're lacking the license, and they're lacking the infrastructure for quality control and lawful distribution. Just a moment, little heart. So in my mind, I would love to see, like, let's say a 12-month period of amnesty where anyone that's involved in the cultivation, distribution of cannabis or any other substance could come forward, purchase a license, set up officially, become licensed entrepreneurs, and instead of having like illegal drug dealers, they're like pizza boys dropping off a delivery, like a takeaway man dropping off delivery. That to me would solve the problem, because some people, the police have said to me in conversation, in a moment, then little heart, have said to me in conversation that they can't legalize because then all these criminals have nothing else to do but to get even more criminal. And in Canada, you've got the situation where like white collar businesses can get involved in cannabis, but the people that have been involved in cannabis for all through prohibition are squeezed out of the market. So that leaves them no other option but to act outside of the market. So if I had my way, would be to bring them into the market, give them the chance to become legal entrepreneurs, to keep supplying their customers as they are doing, with accountability, with quality control, paying their business taxes, paying insurances and all that sort of stuff. Bring it all into the light and get it out of the shadows across the board for everything. That would be my personal solution if I had half a chance to do any policy writing.
Yeah, I agree with you, Phil, and it does feel like as we head towards legalization, at least of cannabis, people who've historically been involved in that market may well be edged out of it, and then where do they go next? So I think it's really important that we do what we can to work together to galvanize voices. Of course, it's a bit of a catch-22 for some people who may not be comfortable kind of voicing certain things, but some of this could be done anonymously. But to have those voices and to have that presented to, you know, whatever channel it's going to be who eventually legalizes it, because it is a very, very serious issue. Other people would go further and say that they don't think cannabis should be taxed, of course, so that should also maybe be factored in. But if the voices aren't around the table and the consequences, what are the unintended consequences perhaps through legalization? It could be quite catastrophic. So yeah, I hear what you're saying, and I think it's a point that needs to be very well considered.
Yeah, if I can throw in a couple of points there, just reacting to what Simba said, that one of the most hilarious signs that you'll ever see is a pub that I mean, you still see it in pubs. The drug dealing is forbidden on these premises. It's like, the fuck do you think is going on over that bar?
Yeah.
And people, I think that there's a real problem in terms of people understanding what the nature of drug dealing is. That's what happens when you go and see your doctor. That's what happens when you go and see the pharmacist, and that's what happens. Look, and these things are regulated, some better than others. And I have to say, the alcohol industry is spectacularly badly regulated, and still the nicotine industry is also still incredibly badly regulated, to the extent that vaping is still frowned upon and finds it difficult to find a place. The fact that nicotine in its smokable form as tobacco can be sold without a license from a sweet shop. And that used to be the caricature of what people used to say about what we were doing at Transform, was that, yeah, you want to sell drugs from sweet shops. The irony is that it is sold from sweet shops. Drugs are currently sold from sweet shops, both alcohol and nicotine in its smokable form, which is lousy to say the least. And the issue of you know, you were talking about Mercedes pulling up at seed banks and stuff, and hydroponic shops. The way that capitalism concentrates capital happens both under prohibition and under legal regulation. Corporates are the watchword in big drug operations in the legal world, whether it's 𝘭𝘪𝘧𝘦 or Diageo, and organized crime groups, the bigger ones, are the watchword in the world of prohibition. And I think that, but the issues are the same. It's the way that governments allow unfettered access by commercial operations, whether that's through the stupidity of prohibition or the failure to adequately regulate capital, is that will always lead to concentrations of power, and that then squeezes out smaller producers. And that's the same right across the piece. And Cleo knows this stuff from the Green Party's work to keep small-scale businesses in operation, and to challenge corporate values and practices in the legal world. And I think it's a real problem. And I think that then, in terms of moving from prohibition to legal regulation, the issue still arises as to how you keep small producers in operation in a world where concentrations of capital are de rigueur. And I think that what's required there, and it's the kind of work that my colleague Charlene Teitel does in Massachusetts, about pushing for equity, as Phil was saying, and making sure that small-scale producers and people with criminal records, people of color, do have access to licenses in a post-prohibition world and are able to operate legal cannabis businesses. And I think that as Phil was saying, should be the case for all drugs. I'm not sure about just legitimizing people who are currently operating unregulated businesses. I think it does need to be tighter than that. Some of these drugs are quite dangerous. And as I say, I think that the alcohol model is lousy. The 2003 Licensing Act says that you're not supposed to serve people who are drunk. And that's just not enforced. And the kind of inability and unwillingness of government to enforce, and you know, that law shouldn't be on the books if it's not going to be enforced. You have to be realistic about what is enforceable. I'm not saying that you should never sell any to anybody who's drunk, but the question is, would you sell heroin or coke to someone who's absolutely trashed? And or indeed any other drugs where you know that there's going to be a mismatch. And I think that where it's dangerous, and I think that it does raise questions of our current failure to regulate adequately commercial operations in the illicit world of drugs, whether that be pharmaceuticals, nicotine, or alcohol.
It's actually, makes me think of a rather interesting point. There is, we recently saw gabapentin become a scheduled drug and become criminalized. That then went from being a pharmaceutical to an illicit street drug because of its wide availability. We've obviously seen with the oxycodone crisis in America and what happened with Purdue Pharmaceuticals and how they made a $15 billion empire off selling drugs and were heralded as pioneers within their industry. And yeah, and it came to me with the idea of saying selling drugs from a sweet shop, and we think of every supermarket, yeah, you've got alcohol and everything else, but you go down that aisle with paracetamol and whatever else, you can kill yourself with a lot of those substances in there. Yet through education, through the regulation of only 2 packs per thing, you can sort of put enough of a barrier between that. But if somebody was convinced to do it, they just go Tesco, Asda, Morrison's, boom, there's your 6 boxes, they're done. So what it's about individual responsibility as an adult. The state has a certain responsibility and always will, but we have to promote the idea that if you're an adult, if you can join the army and go and kill somebody, if you can get married, if you can, you know, commit to whatever sexual relationship and dynamic that you choose, and you can do that knowing that there's no other intervention from society, surely we should be able to do the same with drugs. Because I mean, the World Health Organization's own statistics, it's somewhere in the region, if they ballpark it, of 85 to 90% of all people that use any substance do so with very low problematic or to no negative intervention. When you crack that open, cannabis sits about 10%, cocaine sits I think 23%, whereas tobacco and alcohol get a lot closer to 40%. So if we then really look at the consequences and harms of substances, not through the lens of drugs and alcohol, but through what is a drug and the potential harms of substances and compounds, we would be including sugar into this conversation. We would be regulating a lot more goddamn things. And this is part of the conversation people are having around COVID, of going, wait, if we're going to go to these extreme measures to prevent these deaths, it has to be applicable to everything else. Stop people driving in cars, stop people eating fast food, stop people jumping out of planes, stop people scuba diving, stop people, do you know what I mean? And so that's been wound back to go, wait, yeah, you are correct. People who are adults can make informed decisions. So we have to provide that information. So I guess my question is, what can we do to incentivize politicians, to incentivize the media, to incentivize campaigns and communities to tell the goddamn truth about drugs?
Need more people to stand up and tell their truth.
Yeah, I agree with that. Also, going back to what Danny was saying about some of the work that is quite positive in the right direction of travel in some force areas with, you know, their PCCs and chief constables, etc. And, you know, but then the kind of clash in attitude with, say, the Home Office. But actually, you know, you do have the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners, And again, that those will be a body that meets regularly and does discuss. So again, it's about how do we get these things on the agendas of our local PCCs to then raise it in those forums. And I did see on Twitter that, you know, all the newly elected PCCs have just had, you know, a meeting with Priti Patel, for example. So there is the scope to actually influence and inform, and perhaps those voices would be voices that would be listened to an extent. So I guess it's the local and then moving to the national, but trying to use those forums where we can, knowing now that they exist, of course, which I wouldn't have known had I not have run for PCC.
Yeah, yeah. I absolutely agree with Cleo that it's about acting locally and nationally, influencing what you can. One of the most important ones, though, going back to the issue of where the Misuse of Drugs Act came from, it came from the Misuse of Drugs Bill, which was drafted by civil servants supporting MPs in the House of Commons, who then voted the legislation through. And that's why we have I mean, prohibition did exist before then, but not in the way that it does now. So it was MPs who brought it in, and it's MPs who can take it out. I'd strongly recommend to anybody who's serious about prioritizing drug policy reform to stop voting for prohibitionist candidates. Because if you continue to vote them in, they will continue to support the prohibition. It's real simple. If your MP is a supporter of prohibition, go and see them, and get yourself clued up, and Transform, amongst other organisations, will help support you in that process. And go and educate them in the politest, kindest way you can. But really, you have to stop voting for prohibitionist candidates, because it's ultimately that. It's the threat. See, coming back to the issue of power, politicians maintain power by being politicians. And if you stop voting for them, they don't have any power. If they're fearful that they may lose that power as a result of holding a particular position, they will stop holding that position. Unless they're dyed-in-the-wool prohibitionists. But that really, most people will be flexible if it means as simple as saying that they may maintain their salary in the role that they want in a position of power. And I think it's really important that we treat currently the only way that we have to influence legislation is through influencing our MPs. And so stop voting for prohibitionist MPs. And if you have a prohibitionist MP, go see them and educate them.
What's encouraging though as well is that there is this all-party parliamentary group, which is cross-party. I think there's over 50 MPs, as I said at the start, and they did actually meet last night, and they are pushing for drug reform. So again, I guess it's a case of actually looking up and seeing who those MPs are, and as well as referencing the work they're doing when you write to your local MP. But the fact that there is the all-party parliamentary group is encouraging, which can also lead to perhaps a select committee, and this can influence change in a big way.
Have you heard there was the private members bill by Tommy Shepherd that was tabled, I think it was in February, for the decriminalisation of non-problematic drug use? He's trying to call for the end of Misuse of Drugs Act because it's no longer fit for purpose, and for substance use to be considered as a health issue, no longer a criminal issue, with the decriminalisation of the possession of a 10-day dose of a drug, which I found a bit questionable because I use like 7 grams of weed a day, I do, and some people might only use 1 gram. So this 10-day dose is a bit of a questionable area, but the general thing was, I think, a similar number of MPs, same sort of MPs who supported the 2018 legislation change for the use of cannabis for medical purposes. So it seems to be the same sort of bunch, so to speak. And I've got my eye quite keenly on this bill. I can't remember what its second reading is, but I'm very keen to see how Tommy Shepherd's bill progresses. And like Danny mentioned, the misuse of drugs came in on a bill, and it can go out on a bill if the right MPs get behind it. And it's about making the public support, you see. If we can get public wanting change, and like like you said, the MPs will change if they're going to lose their votes. So we've got to make it a vote issue, really.
Yeah, they are but sails. They will blow with the wind. So interestingly, a conversation to be had now. Then, if we look at, say, the Conservative Drug Party Reform Group and Labour, similar one. If we look at some of the MPs involved within that, and we look at their vested interests, a point I brought up to Tommy Chong on my podcast recently was the idea of co-option. That are what we are starting to see now with certain politicians still supporting of prohibition, but are more interested in kind of getting ahead of the curve rather than allowing global movements to end the war on drugs internationally, but to create regulated markets and medicinalize certain compounds. I think especially of psilocybin from magic mushrooms, LSD, ketamine, and DMT, which are all being highly researched in very sort of conservative and academic circles. It is also being touted in quite, what do you call it? Sort of the money rags, for lack of a better way of describing it, as the next big thing. They're saying that the potential investment into psychedelics is going to be far larger than cannabis. So I'm wondering, how much do we think of what is going down is genuine, to the sense of, no, you're right, we violated your human rights for 50 years. If you're allowed to drink a pint, you should be able to have a spliff or have a line or whatever. Do we really think it's this genuine, or do you think that there could be other underlying factors?
I'm a bit too cynical for that. I kind of see it moving to the pharmaceuticalization of various compounds, like you just mentioned, for therapeutic use, with the unjustified maintenance of prohibiting those items for other adult purposes, I would call it, rather than recreational use. Interesting, I was looking at Misuse of Drugs Act today while I was doing a bit of reading about the Misuse of Drugs anniversary, and there was about the thing of what is misuse, which hasn't been answered definitively by the Home Office, despite our frequent asking. But I did see reference in this document about it is the use of drugs that can be used for medication to induce euphoria. So it's basically the use of things. This is what this particular definition said. So, using something to get high and not to treat an illness is misuse, is what it was trying to say, which I find absolutely ludicrous, because it's not acknowledging alternative uses of these substances despite their therapeutic efficacy. I used to get off my tits and MDMA and dance like a nutter all weekend. I had children and I stopped taking drugs and became dad. But I went to a folk festival 2 or 3 years ago, and bear in mind, people might not know this actually, I've been disabled by chronic myofascial pain from joint hypermobility spectrum disorder for about it's far too many years now, since 2013. And I am like crippled by pain every day. And if it wasn't for cannabis, I wouldn't be moving, and pharmaceutical drugs nearly killed me that many times I won't touch them anymore. But I was at a festival and I met a man who knew what he was doing. He had some lovely pure MDMA. He asked me what my body weight was. I told him and he gave me a dose. Before I took it, I said, look, I've got kids. I don't want to die. And he said, trust me, I know what I'm doing. And I trusted him. And I was able to dance for the first time in years to 2 bands. I managed to do 2 full sets to 2 bands. And I think I was up for 5 days, actually. I didn't sleep for 5 days. I was absolutely loving it. And it was the best pain relief I'd ever had. I even wrote to the Beckley Foundation afterwards and said to them, you want to start looking at MDMA for pain relief, because, it's been remarkable for me. And it's amazing how these drugs that are used by adults for either exploring their consciousness, for enjoying life, or even just easing stress, whatever the purpose is, they do also have potential therapeutic aspects. But it seems right now they want to capitalize on those whilst prohibiting the other adult uses. We need to identify that it's useful for these other things. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it does. So it very much feels like they want to, what you're saying is they want to sort of co-opt and take the therapeutic benefits while still criminalizing the cultures.
Yes.
You think of the Glastonbury hippies and the magic mushrooms. You think of North Wales and their mushroom community. Yeah. You know what I mean? You think of, like, I don't know, the Scottish Gabba hard tech scene, with ketamine and MDMA and stuff. There's communities and cultures that have been thriving for decades that they're going to just go, no, you have no benefit. I mean, I've often espoused that my intervention or my sort of introduction to cannabis was one of the things that blew my mind and open. I was quite a racist, bigoted, hateful, misogynistic, homophobic little boy. I was angry and hateful because I was raised in a very horrible environment. I was bitter and aggressive. And these substances and these spaces that were created, be they festivals, be they free parties, be they squatter parties, whatever sort of spectrum you want to look at this, to grand arenas, those experiences opened my eyes to this much wider world. and blew away that ignorance and that racism, that hatred, that underlying tone of ultimately the dislike of the other. I was so damaged that anybody that dared or was allowed to be different to me, I hated. I was like that crab in a bucket. I wanted to pull everybody back down. And these compounds, not in a therapeutic setting with psychiatry, but out in a field with a bunch of dirty hippies hugging a bunch of three lads, raving away at 5 a.m, you know what I mean? That experience did far more for me than I think the 20 years of therapy that I have gone through since my childhood. Because those experiences were so dramatic and so powerful. I can't remember any of the CBT, DBT, whatever other therapies I've been through, but I'll tell you what, I can almost remember the smell of people from a mosh pit. You know what I mean? I remember the feeling of shuddering as the sunrise washes over my body and every hair and fiber stands up as I'm surrounded by people from all communities, all ethnicities and groups. Those are the experiences that cannot be prescribed. You cannot regulate that. They need to decriminalize those activities. So. Sorry, I got a bit of a rant there. Anyway, continue.
It's a very good point, because it is about our humanity, isn't it? And consciousness and the tools that the earth has provided for us to embrace who we are and to get closer to who we are. And very much in line with ecocide, it seems that we have people in power who are hell-bent on not allowing that to happen. And just listening to your testimonials there, it also kind of makes me think of the criminal justice bill and criminal justice act and the kind of prohibition on gathering as human beings and celebrating ourselves and dancing and having euphoria. Why is euphoria such a bad thing? Why is it illegal to feel that sense of what it is to have those kind of connections? So I think all of these things are symptoms of a very bizarre psychotic system, actually, that we've inherited over generations and generations, that seek to kind of just oppress and take us far away from who we are and our connection to each other. So some very deep and important work that needs to be done. How we do it, I'm not sure, but certainly having these kind of forums and attacking things on the local level like we've discussed, and also bringing to the fore different, we've just heard about the cultures we have here on our doorsteps. You just spoke about the Welsh community and mushrooms and all the rest of it. When we think of indigenous tribes and people, it isn't something that's necessarily a million miles away or in another country. It can be right on our doorsteps. And let's embrace these and let's have these voices at the forefront who've had these experiences and has been part of culture for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years.
I'd like to pick up on your mention of consciousness there, if you don't mind, Cleo. A big thing about the WTU, we are about cannabis, but we're not really. We're about human rights, freedom of consciousness being one of them, the rights, the freedom of association, which you just mentioned, becoming prohibited soon, and also the right to autonomy of health, the free development of personality, and the right to private beliefs and practices. They're all fundamental human rights. And apparently, at the human rights level of law, they can only infringe those rights when it's within the interest of democratic society and protecting public health. And it is because of the alleged threat of drugs to public health that they are justified in trampling upon our human rights under prohibition bills. But it does stipulate in the human rights legislation, there's a little tiny word that they all seem to be missing, and it's the word "and." And I can't remember it all off the top of my head. It's in my book. I wish I'd found the page now. I didn't anticipate referring to this. But really, until an individual who is consuming any substance is causing harm to another, technically speaking, under the legislation, they haven't really got the right to enforce it because of this little word "and" that keeps being missing by barristers and legal people because they're propping up the system. So I think if more people go in and defend themselves and try and focus on this word and ask, where is the harm that I was causing? Who have I harmed in my actions? Because technically speaking, the human rights law, until we cause harm to another, the state shouldn't be interfering in our lives, but they are doing so, I would say, unlawfully. But that hasn't been ascertained in a courtroom yet, so it'd have to be argued that way. But they shouldn't deny our freedom of consciousness. Last thing I'd like to touch on quickly, rite of passage. You mentioned communities, tribal people using, I think, simple know the word, entheogens, is it?
Entheogens.
Thank you. So, we as humans, we've always had a rite of passage as when we enter adulthood. And now, because the state dictate that the only recreational drug that people are allowed to use to expand their consciousness or experience life is alcohol. You know, when you turn 18, often people go out and get people really drunk until they're sick and do all kinds of things, and that then becomes their pattern because that was the way they were introduced to that drug, and it's the only drug available. So I kind of feel that, again, all options should be available under the freedom of consciousness for people to determine themselves. And same as with alcohol. Until you're drunk and disorderly or drugged and disorderly and causing harm to another, the state shouldn't be interfering at all. Their only responsibility, in fact, should be to make sure all products are as quality assured as possible, and the same as all other products that are available on the market. So I feel they're failing there. They are failing the populace by not quality controlling the drugs that people are using anyway. Yes.
Very valid points. And actually, I don't know if you saw my eyes go off there, because I was literally, that was my 18th birthday, and I drank like that for about 4 years afterwards because of the colleagues I was working with, the people I hung around with. That was my pattern. And actually, until you said it that way, I really didn't get it. But we have this mechanism in UK law that you can drink alcohol from 5 years old within the family home. So the idea of this is to be able to have a soft introduction for you to be able to reduce the taboo, to reduce this sensational thing that's hidden over there, you know, mommy and daddy's special juice. And so that you can get an introduction to hopefully avoid that first like drop into the deep end and then being exposed to this culture and the potential long-term health consequences. As we know, alcohol is now, I think it's comorbid in 5%, 1 in 20 of all deaths in the world, this substance. Yet it's still, they're happy with it. It's not regulated. It's not in any scheduling system in any government's Misuse of Drugs Act. It is not regulated in that way. It sits separate from this. That is the power of the lobbying of this industry. And look at what we've seen of reforms over the past few years. That tiny, drink responsibly. Please drink responsibly. At the bottom, just a little bit in the bottom corner. And that's enough to obfuscate 1 in 20 people's deaths. If the cost of, I think, alcohol to the NHS, I'm not going to say the number, actually, I can't pull the exact amount out of my ass, but it is exceptionally high in the billions. Like I say, it's comorbid in, I think, 5, 6, 7 maybe different primary cancer types, because of the way it affects the immune system, because of the way that it affects cell growth. It's actually classified also as a neurological retardant because it slows the processing of neurons in the brain. Yet you turn on BBC Radio 1, you turn on any of the radio stations, actually any of the news, all they're ever talking about at 7, 8 a.m. is waiting for that end of shift so they can go and get drunk. When they're still now counting down the June 21st thing, they were counting down it to May when the pubs reopen. This kind of backwards approach to this. The alcohol, you can walk in a supermarket, children can walk down the alcohol aisle. You haven't created some barriers and some system. You haven't obfuscated it and hidden it behind them. And you look at what's happening now with youth getting access to tobacco. Again, because we're covering it in supermarkets and we're making it secretive and taboo, they want more access to this. So we have to have this thing of going, well, I'm not suggesting that we have heroin and needles and stuff available on aisle 17 at Asda, but that there has to be a kind of universal approach to this, because otherwise if you create false tiers, you create false expectations of safety to people. People go, oh, I won't take one ecstasy pill at a rave because I might die, but they'll drink for 40 years and destroy their body. It's abhorrent. It's ridiculous.
It is. I mean, the contradictions are just so huge. I mean, why alcohol doesn't carry a health warning, why it doesn't carry an ingredients list. All other products that you consume, aside, interestingly, from tobacco, which also doesn't carry an ingredients list, and there's a lot of permitted additives. I remember I many years ago, I contacted the Department of Health to ask them why there was no ingredients list on tobacco, and why there was no health warning on alcohol. And their answer for why there's no health warning on alcohol was that alcohol drunk, this is a quote, alcohol drunk in appropriate amounts, in moderate amounts, in appropriate circumstances, is not a danger to health. And it's like, whoa, well, that's crack and amphetamine, and that's it. You know, if you use them responsibly and appropriately, none of them are particularly dangerous. So it's how you use them. Even fentanyl, which is very dangerous when used on the street, is used medicinally and absolutely appropriately and wisely. So the issue here really is that there does need to be a leveling of the playing field. I can't remember why. That's what they said. That smoked tobacco is so dangerous that smoking it at all. Why would you want to put an ingredients list on it? It was just kind of not part of their thinking. So I contacted the Tobacco Manufacturers Association, who very kindly sent me a 32-page booklet with the list of, I think it was 500 permitted additives in tobacco products, one of which was sugar to, and I don't know if this is still true, it was many years ago, sugar to a level of 10%. Now, sugar is nice on your cereal, but do you want to smoke it? And do you want to not know that you're smoking 10%, up to 10% sugar in your tobacco products? This is, I mean, it's ludicrous beyond belief that so many of the, you know exactly what's in a tin of beans, but you don't know what's in your tobacco products. I mean, it's crazy. Just some other things, just to throw into the mix. In the 1961 Single Convention on Drugs, drug addiction and supply is described as evil. There's only one other UN convention that uses the term evil, and it's a convention on, I think, on sex trafficking. And it's because of the influence of the Holy See, the Vatican, both at the League of Nations and at the United Nations, that meant the term evil went in there. And it's almost straight, word for word, out of the Catholic Catechism. So this idea of there being this totally different sector of drugs that is totally different from the drug alcohol that is used in the communion service. I mean, it's just, again, it just, the hypocrisy of it just beggars belief. A couple of other things to throw in. The issue of things like fun, pleasure, freedom, curiosity, ritual, cognitive liberty, which are often just excluded from the entirety of the debate. And it becomes about very, very cold, hard facts and data, but they're things that we as we know apply in a whole lot of other areas, but deny in this area, sometimes for the sake of winning arguments, because we begin to sound like hippies or that we're in the land of woo-woo. But these are really, really fundamental parts of what goes on in drug culture and drug subcultures around the world. One other last thing to throw in is the issue of medical pop, medical psychedelics, therapeutic use of drugs versus just having fun. I mean, there's some real problems here. And part of it relates to commercialization. I think, if I remember correctly, that there was one outfit that was looking to venture into commercial therapeutic psychedelics that was looking to patent pillows. And I mean, you're looking at something really, really horrible going on there, where it really is this kind of, what you think, people haven't been lying down in comfy spaces taking drugs, and that you can patent the bloody pillow as part of this process. Forgive me if I've got that wrong, but I'm pretty sure it was something like that. And again, just coming to the therapeutic bit, there's a real danger of this spearheading the move into, as Phil was saying, the move into commercialization, and away from cultural, just social, indigenous use, as it were. And last time I looked, and again, forgive me if this has changed, there is a major difference between the Labour group for drug policy reform and the Conservative one. The Conservative one, I'm pretty sure, is funded by the cannabis industry. And the Labour one isn't. And I think that we just have to be very, very keenly aware of who's pulling levers in different places. And it's not about conspiracies. The fact is, when drugs become legalized, there are opportunities for legally commercial outfits who are ready to embark on the process of producing and selling them, or investors to move in and make a shed load of money. I have to say, it seems as if the cannabis bubble has burst big time, and that people who were looking to make shed loads of dosh out of it haven't necessarily had their fingers burnt, but it hasn't turned into the cash cow that they thought it was going to be. And I think I mean, I hope that continues, because if those of us who've come from a social justice position in terms of campaigning for reform, it's just so sad to see this become another way of making a buck. It's grim. It just is. And it just takes all the energy out of you when you see this turning into a shit show that it's become in various places, and whole countries now being taken over by cannabis businesses to grow dope in places where it's illegal to bloody use it.
Well, yeah, it's an interesting one. It brings correlation back to what you were saying, because actually Canada leads the forefront of international investment in terms of the ventures that went into that. The vast majority of the money that was put in 2018 was alcohol and tobacco. Look at what British American Tobacco have done, Philip Morris. You know, look at the 9 out of 10, if not now, I think the 10th largest beer manufacturer who've invested billions each into infrastructure. They're trying to make cannabis smokable because they already have the vertically integrated infrastructure to provide it. You know, you've got those kinds of similar smokable. So British American Tobacco released a very cryptic press release basically saying that they are looking towards non-nicotine combustibles, which is cannabis. You can't not say that's not cannabis. Come on. You know, and the same is then true of...
Unless they mean DMT.
I'm willing to back that. If they're going to sell a 10 box of DMT sticks down the street, in a couple of years, we will solve majority of our goddamn problems. We'll have a whole heap of new ones, but we'll have solved a lot of the primal ones. But it just shows that that's where the money is moving. Look at the energy industry as well, as they're trying to then co-opt the potential technological capacities of this. I've been sat here all night with a piece of cannabis graphene next to me. That's a hemp thermal block. You know, you've got plastics that can be made of this. You've got hempcrete for housing. These kind of technologies are being ignored because they're chasing the flower money. They want those dad dealer money from those ounces, from those kilos, and they're missing this. And exactly what you're saying about exploitation of certain regions around the world, I think of Lethos. Off the top of my head, the landlocked kingdom inside South Africa. It's a tiny little place. They started with a really progressive thing of going, right, we're going to give out 6 licenses to domestic companies, and we're going to really try and figure this shit out. Within the first year, they were all bought up by Israel, Australia, Canada, and the UK. They've then used that power and that influence to then change and adapt the regulations for their new distribution. So they're now selling and importing that into fucking Europe. It's not helping them directly at home. That money has then gone into the pots of companies like Canopy, who have through back doors bought out those license holders. So we're seeing that conglomeration at the very top is working out for them. If you were part of the boys club and you sat in those meetings, this is all playing out wonderfully, because the same people who are making that bank in Canada are sat in political lobbying groups in the Houses of Westminster and going, not that way, not that way, this way, this way. And yet Canada's corporate version of legalization is one of the things I detest most about this. Yes, it ends punitive measures for the majority of people in sort of average circumstances. But the creation of, I think it was 35 new laws, so it went up from 7 to 45 laws governing it, one of which is over possession. You have 31 grams on the street and you've jaywalked or you've committed some other contributory crime. That's 5 years in federal prison. You have 31 seeds on you, because 1 seed is 1 gram. That's 5 years in federal goddamn prison. They haven't ended the criminalization of this. They've created a profit model that they can regulate and sell their products back to you, while criminalizing the idea of you home growing and creating your own local economy, while demonizing and destroying clubs and lounges and consumption spaces that are not vertically integrated into their supply models. They are using this power now to exert it in places you wouldn't imagine. There's reasons places like Thailand and whatever else are popping off, and it is not because their domestic politicians have suddenly gone, let's look at this properly, you know what I mean? It's pressure, it's all international pressure, because they're inflating these bubbles so that then the countries legalize, they make ungodly sums of money, and then look at Canada's projection of investment in the scene, and then 2018 and then drop off. They got in, they made their cash, and they knew to leave because they knew it would take another 5, 6, we're looking at 7 odd plus years before profitability hits the market. So it's only the boys who've got the money to lose, and they're only going to lose this money at this time if they're going to make it back later. And the only way they make it back is they're the ones who control the reform movement. They're the ones who get to write these legislations. And so the last thing I will say on the medicinalization of entheogenic substances or psychedelics is my great fear is the control of the mysterious. Some of the most profound, unexplainable, wonderful moments of my life. I like I said, I can't describe them. I can't give them to you. There were DMT experiences, or meditating for 24 hours and then taking mushrooms around a fire in the woods. Being with people, sitting around at a festival, handing around a DMT pen with others, and joining to such a degree of having this communal connection with people that it then set me off on this journey throughout life. That if that was to happen in a clinical setting, with two psychiatrists that are going to very much control that experience, I feel it limits that potential for discovery. I mean, you think of Francis Crick. He attributed seeing the double helix of the DNA structure while being on LSD. And you've got people like Bill Gates, and I can't pull the other guy's name out of my ass, who said that it was one of the top 3 most valuable experiences, Steve Jobs was the other, most valuable experiences in their lives, and led them on their path to their developments. So if we had to deny that creativity, or if we were to curtail it and control it, it bothers me. It bothers me beyond measure.
Too clinical, that what you described there. Like, I remember that night around the fire, passing that DMT round and round. It was a really good night. If that's the one you're referring to. It's too clinical, to have had. I've had so much healing. I took ecstasy because I wanted to die. Actually, they told me on the news, if you take ecstasy, you're gonna die. I was suicidal because of childhood abuses, and when I was given the opportunity to take some, I took some, and I didn't die. I had an amazing life, and I sorted out a lot of the problems in my own head. And that's when I realised a lot of the information we're given is lies or exaggerated to create fear and control. But the clinical setting you described there, it just wouldn't create the same thing as the natural settings you described do, Simper. So I agree with you completely there.
Yeah, I've got 2 questions, so we might run slightly longer if you guys wouldn't mind sticking around. The first one is, how do we decolonize drug legalization? How do we get rid of this whitewashing upper class bastardry of this reform? And I say that obviously sat here as a middle and lower class white person, but I mean in the sense that if you look at the covers of Forbes, if you look at the investment portfolios, if you look at who owns this shit, who are the CEOs, who are the board, who are the real people making the money off this, they are vast majority conservative, sort of, or Republican, depending on where you're listening to this currently, sort of right-wing intended people that have then they're following the capital. That's all this is. It's another way that then they get social control as a backhand, I guess, because they get to limit that access. But what can we do to ensure that minority voices, the other communities are heard in this? Because if you look at medical cannabis now, it's a bunch of white people who suddenly discovered this magic thing like yesterday, and they're now all of a sudden they're allowed access to it. But the West Indies population that brought ganja over to the UK and Brits, when mass immigration started after the Second World War, when the culture of dub and of sound system culture in those communities that then really started to affect, especially the more impoverished regions, and ensured that commonality. How the hell do we bring a light to this? How do we represent this and degentrify it?
I wish I had the answer.
Big question. It's a big question, but I do believe the same thing that we've said throughout this discussion is the importance of the local and the importance of organising locally and galvanising those voices. Obviously people do talk, chat, socialise, do what they're doing, but actually I don't think, certainly many people I know in Bristol, they may have some sense of organising towards certain things, but that needs to be expanded upon. I do rate the work that both Simper and I were in a discussion a few weeks back, actually, weren't we? With Dr. 𝘰𝘩𝘕 𝘮𝑗𝑗, who's doing quite a lot of work actually in recognition of this 50th, working with what she calls black communities on the kind of social justice angle, and constantly highlighting that all these forums and discussions need to be inclusive and that these voices need to come to the table. So it's always a kind of two-way kind of thing, isn't it? Doing that bit of reaching out and getting that organising going, but also hoping that you're in a place where people will also come into the fold, if you like. But it's an important one. It's very, very critical.
I'd agree with Cleo. It's about acting locally, raising awareness locally, gathering people, giving people a voice. By sharing your story, you empower others to share their story. And the more people that get up and stand up together, same as for homosexual rights, for example, or female rights, or any rights that are being fought for the hard way, it's only when the people shake off the fear of the consequences and gather together en masse, regardless of the consequences, and stand true together in their truth, that change comes about. So I would encourage everyone to get together locally and then turn the lights towards centrally towards Westminster, and then trying to channel that spear from the local to stick it in down in Westminster. Many spears from different directions locally might make the beast bleed.
I think it's such a huge one. I mean, thinking about some of the kind of critiques that come out, particularly in the US, about the need for systemic reform around policing and the whole of the Black Lives Matter movement, really, is the recognition of systemic problems. And I think that the danger here is that we look at the idea of decolonizing drug policy when we actually need to think about decolonizing everything. And I think that if we accept that as a result of colonization, that there is a systemic, again, it comes back to the issue of corruption. This is a broken system. It's a system that is fundamentally bent, and it's bent towards the global north. It's bent towards the wealthy. It's bent towards the ruling class. It's bent in so many ways. It's broken. It's bent and broken. And I think that the recognition, firstly, an understanding, a full understanding, and I don't have it because I'm an old white man, an old white middle class man. Is that the whole thing is colonized right now. It's totally colonized, and I think that it's almost daunting when I think about it in those terms. But I think that then it does come back to where you can act. But I think to maintain a keen awareness of the issue of, to take one example, that so many people who are part of the political and media elite studied PPE at Oxbridge, and it's kind of, Jesus. I mean, and that's still the case. That's not a system that is going to be easy to or certainly can't articulate the issue of colonization because they come from the colonizing class. So that anyone who's involved in this, another one that just came to mind is I should be thinking twice when somebody calls me, like Simpa so kindly did, to take part in this thing. Have you got a black woman who might actually take my place? I mean, it really is as simple as those kind of things, and recognizing where we as representatives of colonizers just accept kind of our place a bit too easily. So I think it's also questioning where we are in that process and making way for other voices, and not just calling on other voices to take their place. It's about relinquishing our place at the table and offering it to somebody else.
I like that. I respect that as well. I mean, it's one of the things that me and Mac, and my co-host of the podcast, would be very mindful of with what we've created with the platform, is to give voice to others, especially the marginalized members of different communities, ethnicities, or races. And it's difficult because what we have found is that, as you were saying, there isn't, unfortunately, that many black women or that many black men or that many Asian or Middle Eastern or whatever, anybody non-white that can do this. Because if they stand up on camera, they use their real name, their job is gone. Their kids are getting taken away. Their landlord suddenly pulls their rental agreement. It's all kinds of different bastardry. I'm very aware of the privilege I sit in, that I have been so dangerously open with Durham Police, and yet I still sit here. I have been entirely open and honest with them with everything I've done, everything I intend to do, and what my intentions are with this. And it is because of that, my class, my perceived privilege and my whiteness, that I'm in that position. So it's, I get what you're saying, but it's, what then can we do to provide, no, I don't want to say provide safe spaces, but just allow them the same privilege, to get it so that anybody has that same right to stand up and go, yes, I consume drugs. It doesn't make me a bad person. Again, you look at all the medical cannabis stories in the mainstream press in this country since 2008. all white, all middle class.
I mean, there are other voices out there. I mean, for those people who don't know, I think Dr. Carl Hart is an extraordinary voice as a leading academic who talks very openly about his drug use and support for change. But they're few and far between. And I think it's tough. It's a tough gig, but I think it's incumbent on us who occupy the role of being a part of the elite to let it go where and when we can. And I say that as someone who readily accepted the opportunity to come onto this panel.
Someone recently pointed out my white middle class privilege, which I laughed at because I feel like I'm broke, poor and disabled and I've got no privilege. But then I began to question this thing that was pointed out to me, and I was glad it's this lady who opened my eyes. And I began to question, you know, if I had been a man of African descent, for argument's sake, would I have been arrested by now while I've been campaigning for the WTU? Because I have been very forthright, outspoken, honest, everywhere with police and Westminster, yet I still remain here at peace doing my thing. And is that because of my colour and because of my social status? I'm an ex-teacher. I've made an adequate evidence bundle for my defence that I'm more than willing to bloody represent myself all the way. So, you know, is that why they leave me alone? I don't know. But like you've just said there, Danny, it's incumbent upon us then. We have a responsibility as anti-colonialists, as you like, to be the people, to move forward and hopefully bring others behind in our wake, I hope.
Yeah, I think all fair points. I suppose one final thing I just wanted to ask. It's a light-hearted one. You can answer it light-hearted or serious as you wish. How much bloody longer do you think this is going to be going down? Are we going to be seeing a 75th anniversary of this? Or do you think at some point they're going to address this? Or are we just going to see things like the 2001 Misuse of Drugs regulations just tacked on so they can take out their little bits while leaving the rest of it criminalised?
Good question. I like to hope and pray that, like Tommy Shepherd's bill, for example, will see all drug use be brought under the remit of health instead of the criminal. In which case, that would be a great change. It wouldn't address the issue of the legal regulation and consumer protection that we would need through a legally regulated market. But aside from hoping and praying for that, I don't know. I mean, they've kept it going for that many years. I fear you might be right, simply. Let me put it that way.
I think we should try to be hopeful. Again, I do feel encouraged by the sort of legislation or the MPs trying to push something through, plus the other MPs and some of the solutions and actions we've spoken about tonight. But that aside, I do have a kind of romantic ideal in my head that sometimes as we move forward for things like reparations and land reform, that there will be a time when people just do have their own land and can do as they want and become self-governed. That is the ideal, really. So they can just completely ignore this system that we're under and acknowledge it. Far-fetched, but we have to dream.
Yeah, I like that. I'm glad I'm not the only dreamer in the room.
I'm really loath to put a date on this, because I did it once before, and it was partly out of wanting to set a goal, out of having an aspiration, and partly because I thought it might be doable, and I was wrong. So in 2004, I predicted that the global drug war would end in 2020, and I was wrong. And I think the thing for me is, so rather than answering the question, because I made a dick of myself last time, is to say that if we can't end the drug war very quickly, what fucking chance do we have with limiting climate change? Because ending the drug war is relatively easy. It really is. And I know it looks hard because of all the things that hold it in place. but I think that given the ease with which it can be changed, and we've seen the changes that have been made, whether they're at local level through decriminalizing possession or the statewide balance in the US on cannabis, we can see how quickly it can change. But the speed with which we need to act now on reducing carbon emissions is as urgent as it gets. And I think that a lot of things begin to pale into insignificance for me. And I take that back, not insignificance, but become relatively insignificant compared to climate change. And I think that again, it's about contextualizing this stuff in the same way that for me, the colonization, systemic colonization of all the structures of government and power are absolutely solid and solid blocks to progressive reforms. The issue of our commitment to the status quo with regard to fossil fuels and other ways of operating that are contributing to climate change are immense. And it's those things really that I think that we do need to, at the same time as acting locally. So there used to be a slogan, act local, think global, act local. Now we need to act local and act global. And I think that the part of that is about, as I said earlier, restoring the relationship or bringing about a new and functional relationship between citizens and government. That when we do that, that we will enable ourselves to bring about the fundamental changes in anti-colonization, anti-colonialism, on climate change, on so many, on gender, on drugs. But it seems to me that if we don't do it within a fundamental system of change, imagine a situation where we hadn't dealt with climate change, but we had legalized drugs. Would we think we'd won? And I leave you with that thought.
Interesting. I suppose I'll throw my 2 cents on this before we then surmise and say goodbye. I believe that the US were instrumental in the creation of this, the reinforcement of this, and they have gained most from this, be it through socioeconomic mechanisms or be it through fundamental control of other nations' political outcomes. I also now believe that the US federal legalization is an inevitability under the current administration. I think there is far too much pressure within the system. They have some nuanced arguments to figure out in terms of banking and whatever else, but they're working on various reforms. If you look at the Safe Banking Act, if you look at MORE Act, if you look at the combination of a few of these, they're getting pretty damn close to it, that if they can get that signed, they can spend the next few years cobbling together the other bits. And when North America is a powerhouse, when Mexico comes on board, that is a trading block. When they recognize that true power of that, and once they get beyond trying to patent it, once they get beyond trying to control the market, they'll see the other avenues for it. And I think that the climate will be tackled because of this. At the minute, they're mulching and destroying a lot of the biomass material rather than utilizing it to replace concrete, to replace plastics, to replace fossil fuels. But there is hope. If you look at the big energy producers, they're slowly moving away from oil and gas. They're calling themselves energy manufacturers now. They're starting to go greener. They're starting to look at this. Yes, the capitalist greed and that mechanism will always be there. But as we approach that curve of self-imposed destruction, there's going to be that crossover point. And I think we're already starting to see it. So I predict here, and I will be held wrong as Danny was, that I think by 2025, the UN are going to be having a serious conversation about creating new global conventions on drugs. If for nothing else, for the free trade of cannabis as a resource, whether it be as the cannabis graphene-derived batteries or other derivable technologies like carbon fiber, etc. That's where I think that's going to go. Ethanols, plastics, and I think that mechanism to save us from climate change can't work under the 88, 61, and 71 conventions. Therefore, they have to draft a new convention. And without America being like dickish about it and I was going to say swinging their dick about it, then they're not going to exert that same pressure. And I think at that point, there will be enough evidence through the medicinalization paradigm for people to just go, well, if it's fine for the sick, it should be fine for the well. And then look at her. I hope not to be sat here with you fine folks in 2025. Go, I'm sorry, I got it wrong. But
Simper, I hope you're right.
Yeah.
I hope you're right.
Anyway, I just want to say thank you very much, guys, for joining me this evening. Thank you all for watching this on Twitch, Facebook, and YouTube. Please do give us a like, share, subscribe, follow, whatever the current format of that platform is. I just want to quickly show you guys this on screen. That is 𝘭𝘵𝘥𝘪𝘳𝘠 to keep up with what Phil's up to. This is 𝘮𝑎𝑙𝑎𝑘E.co.uk to keep up with what Cleo's up to. And this is Danny Kushlick, which is Kushlick Danny on Twitter. I just want to say, sorry, do you raise a question there, Phil?
I want to just chuck out something I meant to mention, talking about challenging the charges with the WTU and CEDAW Future, who was Guy Coxwell, who should have been here this evening. We are launching the FACT card, Fair Access Cannabis Terms card, which is a cannabis challenge card, not just for the sick and dying, but for healthy people too. So I just wanted to shout that out here, and the hope is that the evidence bundles we've presented, people would be able to challenge the charges and put the burden of proof on the CPS and use our evidence bundles against the state's assertion that cannabis is a Schedule 1 drug that warrants Class B sentencing. Both Guy and myself are prepared to be witnesses in any box to be cross-examined by anybody according to the evidence bundles we've created. So we will be launching, hopefully by next week, the week after the latest.
Excellent. We'll have to arrange something to discuss further and give light to that to our audience. Right, any final thoughts, folks, before we leave?
Well, just because we've sort of finished on the kind of climate change angle, bit of positivity and hope, of course, is the news that Shell is being taken to court over climate change. So there is a hope there. And also just to encourage people to follow Green Drug Policy, which is the Green Party Drug Policy Group. On Twitter, it's @Green Drug Policy, and on all the social media. And we have our AGM coming up on the 28th of June, which I believe is open to non-members. So there'll be information going out about that soon.
Excellent, excellent. I've just shown the Green Party Drug Policy Twitter there for the folks at home. Thank you very much, guys.
Can I just one last thing? I am no longer an employee of Transform, but I would like to give them a shout. So Transform Drug Policy Foundation and Anyone's Child, who are both wonderful.
There. And this is a great resource, guys, on transformdrugs.org/timeline for the 50 years of the Misuse of Drugs Act, the campaign that they've been running. So do please check it out. Right, thank you very much, folks. Please do like, share, subscribe wherever you are, and we will see you later. Peace and love.
Take care. Keep